The silence of the morning city was broken only by the occasional sounds of cars and the rustle of leaves underfoot. Amara, a black woman in her 30s, was walking with her daughter Layla, holding her hand tightly. They walked along the street, looking at the shop windows, admiring the tranquility of this day. Layla was telling something cheerfully. Her melodious childish voice was filled with carelessness. Amara smiled as she listened to her daughter, but she was uneasy in her heart. She always felt this slight tension when she went out on the streets of her city. Over the years, she had become accustomed to wary glances, sometimes hidden hostility, which was impossible not to notice. But today, she hoped they could just enjoy the walk. Suddenly, she felt something change. There was a sense of tension in the air, as if something menacing was approaching. Amara instinctively turned her head and noticed a policeman walking towards them. He was tall, with cold eyes, and his face expressed nothing but obvious irritation. Amara tensed, her heart pounding faster. She pulled Layla closer to her, instinctively trying to protect her. "Hey, stop!" the policeman ordered loudly as he came closer. There was unequivocal aggression in his voice. Amara stopped, turned to face him, trying to remain calm. She saw that the situation did not bode well. The policeman stopped in front of them, looking directly at Amara, ignoring Layla. "Show me the documents," he said roughly, as if leaving no doubt that he didn't need any explanations. He had already made up his mind. "On what basis?" Amara asked calmly, holding her daughter's hand tighter. The policeman narrowed his eyes. His gaze became even more vicious. "Based on what I said, you don't just walk around here." He took a step closer, as if cornering her, even though there were only empty streets around. Amara felt an alarm rising inside her. Her brain was frantically searching for a way out of this situation. Amara felt the tension building with every passing second. She looked at the policeman, at his face contorted with anger, and realized that it wasn't about the documents. There was something else here, something much more dangerous. Layla clung to her leg, looking at the uniformed man in fright, feeling her mother's tension. "Mom," the girl whispered, her voice trembling. Amara didn't answer. Her brain was quickly searching for a way out. She knew that if she panicked, things would only get worse. But what to do? Run away? It would only make her feel guilty in this man's eyes. Confront him? This could provoke aggression. "I'm with my daughter," Amara tried to explain, remaining calm. "We're just walking. There is no reason for conflict." "Are you walking?" The policeman grinned. His eyes narrowed. "There are plenty of places where you can walk around. Only here, people like you usually have other things to do. Breaking the law. Or maybe you're hiding something." He took a sharp step forward, his hand reaching for the belt where the handcuffs hung. Amara felt her body stiffen with fear, but she took a step back, away from him, shielding Layla with herself. "I'm not going anywhere with you," she said firmly, her voice sounding more confident than she felt. "I don't have anything illegal. Call for backup if you want, but I'll stay here." The policeman grinned. His tone became even colder, as if he was enjoying this moment. "You think you're in charge here, right? Do you think you can tell me what to do?" He pulled out the handcuffs and took a step forward, his eyes flashing menacingly. "You're coming with me now, and it's better not to resist." The situation was getting more dangerous. Amara knew that arguing with him was a dead end. She needed to do something urgently. But how? She looked around, hoping that someone would notice what was happening. The street was quiet and empty. There was nowhere to wait for help. At that moment, Layla, feeling her mother's despair, suddenly began to cry. Her fragile voice cut through the tension, and it distracted the policeman for a moment. Amara saw this as a chance. "Listen," she began again, trying to speak firmly but calmly. "My daughter is scared. Do you like it? Do you want the child to remember you as a person who scares people on the street?" The policeman blinked, his gaze momentarily less confident, but then his face frowned into an evil mask again. "That's your problem," he muttered, but Amara noticed that his confidence was a little shaky. She slowly took another step back, still holding Layla's hand. The situation hung on a thin line. The policeman tensed, his hand still clutching the handcuffs, but for a second he frowned, as if undecided. Amara felt that she needed to act quickly. She was looking for the slightest opportunity to get out of this situation, until he took them under arrest or, worse, used force. Layla, sobbing, clung to her mother's hand, her tears rolling down her cheeks. "Do you seriously want to be looked at as a person who threatens a woman with a child?" Amara continued, remaining calm. although everything inside was screaming with fear. It's just a walk, and we didn't do anything wrong. Please let us go. The policeman raised one eyebrow. His gaze was as cold as ice. He was clearly struggling with inner demons, torn between the desire to show his power and the doubt that arose from the crying girl. The police don't do charity work, he said with a grin. The rules are the same for everyone, understand? His words were harsh, but his eyes flashed with something that could be a shadow of doubt. Perhaps he realized that he had crossed the line, or perhaps he was afraid of attention from the outside if things went to extremes. Amara noticed this change and realized that she needed to continue to put pressure on his conscience if he had any humanity left at all. She slowly pulled Layla closer, her eyes now showing not only determination, but also pleading. Please, she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. We just want to go home. That's all we need. The silence hung between them, tense and unbearable. The policeman did not look away, but his breathing became a little heavier, as if he did not know what to do next. But at that moment, a figure approached them from afar, a woman in a business suit, and her face expressed concern. She noticed the scene and her gaze fell on the policeman, then on Amara and Layla. Hey, what's going on here? What is it? She asked loudly, raising her hand to attract attention. The policeman turned abruptly. This unexpected intervention confused him. The woman was getting closer, her eyes determined to intervene. Maybe this was their chance. Amara felt her heart stop for a moment. You said, keep writing in an interesting way. The policeman stiffened sharply. His cold gaze darted to the woman who was confidently approaching them. Her stern gaze and decisive steps instantly changed the dynamics of what was happening. She looked like a person used to taking responsibility. What's going on here? She repeated louder. Having almost reached them, there was a note of authority in her voice, and it made the policeman take a step back, although his fingers were still tightly gripping the handcuffs. Amara, sensing that the situation was starting to turn the other way, took a step forward despite her fear. She met the woman's gaze and spoke quickly. We were just walking down the street, and this officers decided to stop us for no reason. The woman stopped a few steps away from them and looked at the policeman, who apparently realized that the situation was getting out of his control. Officer, I'm Rachel Maxwell's lawyer, she said in a firm voice, and I need to know on what basis you are trying to detain this woman and her child. The policeman frowned, his face contorted with displeasure, but now he clearly felt insecure. He looked around, realizing that people were beginning to gather around. A couple of passers-by stopped in the distance, noticing what was happening, their faces expressing concern. I'm just doing my job, he muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. No one provided me with the documents, and I had the right to request them. That's not a reason to act aggressively, Rachel countered, her voice getting even tougher. You approached them with a clear threat. I can see it in their reaction, and the way you hold the handcuffs. She took a step closer to the policeman, her eyes blazing with rage. If you don't explain a specific reason for the detention, I'll contact the department right now, she warned, taking her phone out of her bag, and I'm sure they'll be extremely interested in your behavior. The policeman hesitated, his hand involuntarily loosened its grip on the handcuffs. At that moment, Amara felt the tension in her bodies a little. She didn't know who this woman was, but her intervention was the salvation. Okay, the policeman muttered with obvious reluctance, putting the handcuffs back on his belt. But next time, be careful where and how you walk. He glared at Amara once more and, turning around, slowly walked away. Amara couldn't believe her eyes were free, but her heart was still racing, and she was clutching Leela's hand tightly, who had finally stopped crying. Thank you so much, Amara breathed, turning to Rachel, her voice trembling with tension. I do not know what we would have done without you. Rachel nodded, her face softening now. She put the phone away and looked at Layla with a slight smile. It's all right, she replied, but this man could have gone too far. You're lucky I was around. Amara couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Her mind was filled with fear and gratitude at the same time. This collision with reality could have ended tragically if it hadn't been for Rachel. It all started with the little things. The day after meeting with the policeman, Amara noticed that one of the tires of her car was punctured. At first, she didn't think much of it so things happened, but a strange feeling of unease wouldn't let her go. Then she found scratches on the hood, as if someone had deliberately passed something sharp on the metal. It could have been accidental vandalism, But inside Amara there was a growing suspicion that all this was not accidental. A few days passed, and Amara began to notice more ominous signs. Once, on her way back from work, she noticed a police car parked nearby. The policeman did not go out in it, and did not do anything suspicious, but his gaze, directed directly at her, did not give rest. Her gut instinct told her that this was the same policeman who had tried to arrest her. He continued to watch her, perhaps biding his time. At night, Amara would wake up to the sound of footsteps or muffled voices outside the window. Layla, fortunately, slept soundly, but Amara could no longer feel safe. Even at home, her anxiety grew every day. One evening, when Layla was already asleep, Amara heard a scratching at the front door. She abruptly got up from the couch, her heart beating faster. She crept up to the door and peered through the peephole. There was no one there, but the strange feeling did not go away. Suddenly, the sound of muffled giggles came from outside the door. She held her breath. It didn't look like a joke or an accident. Someone clearly wanted to scare her. Fear gripped Amara's body, but she knew she couldn't show weakness. She quickly went to the window and cautiously looked out into the street. In the dim light of the streetlights, she noticed a shadow moving away from her house. The figure was blurry, but the gait and silhouette reminded her of that policeman. This can't be a coincidence, she thought. My chest was squeezed by the feeling that danger was very close. The next morning, when Amara was about to take Leela to school, her heart stopped for a moment. On the windshield of her car was written in paint, "We're watching you." The huge letters caught my eye, and everything went cold inside. She hurriedly took Layla away from the car, trying not to let the girl notice the inscription, and called Rachel. "He won't stop," Amara said when the lawyer arrived at her house. "This is clearly revenge for your interference. He's trying to intimidate us." Rachel examined the car carefully and frowned. "This is serious," she said. "We have to report this to the police immediately." "To the police?" Amara chuckled, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "You can see how they work. One of them is that threat." Rachel thought about it, then nodded firmly. "You're right, but we can't sit around and wait for the situation to get worse. I have connections, and I will try to bring this to the attention of the press." That evening, Rachel published an article in the local news with a story about how Amara was being harassed. This caused a resonance. People expressed support in the comments, but there were also those who accused Amara of being to blame and provoking the police. Several days passed in nervous anticipation. Amara started looking around every time she left the house, and even took Leela to school through the back entrance. She no longer felt safe in her own neighborhood. One night, when the whole house was asleep, there was a loud crash. Amara woke up to the sound of broken glass and abruptly jumped out of bed. She rushed to the window and saw her car on fire. Someone threw a Molotov cocktail at her. Bright flames lit up the night sky, and her heart stopped. Leela, waking up from the noise, began to cry, clinging to her mother in fright. Amara, in a panic, grabbed the phone and called the fire department. Footsteps sounded behind her. She turned around and saw a shadow near the fence. It was him. The policeman stood watching the flames, and then calmly turned around and disappeared into the darkness. As the flames consumed her car, Amara realized that he would not stop until he had completed his task. Amara stood motionless, her hands trembling, and her eyes did not leave the burning car. Her mind did not have time to comprehend that all this was really happening. Thick smoke filled the air, corroding her eyes, but all she could think about was that her life, Layla's life, was now under constant threat. The sound of sirens was getting closer, but it seemed so far away. Layla continued to cry, clutching her hand, her small body shaking with fear. Amara knew she had to act, that this fire was just a warning, and the next blow could be much more serious. She hugged her daughter tighter, trying to suppress the panic inside. Firefighters arrived quickly, starting to extinguish the car, but the fire had already almost completely engulfed it. When the fire was extinguished, only the charred frame remained instead of the car. Amara finally dialed Rachel's number, her voice hoarse with excitement. "He was here," she said, barely holding back tears. "He set the car on fire. I saw him." "Are you sure?" Rachel asked, her voice serious. "Did you see that it was him?" "Yes, I know it's him." Amara couldn't hold back any longer. "He was standing there, looking at us while everything was burning." Rachel sighed on the other end of the line, realizing that this situation was getting more dangerous. "We can't wait any longer. I will contact several journalists and activists tomorrow. We will take this story to a new level. Bah, Amara, you're going to have to leave for a while. It's too risky. I do not know how far he is willing to go. Amara hugged Layla to her and ran her hand through her tangled hair, realizing that Rachel was right. They could no longer live in fear every day. The next day, Amara and Leah packed up everything they needed and went to Rachel, who offered them temporary shelter. She didn't want to leave her house, but she had no choice as Layla had to be safe. Meanwhile, Rachel has launched an active campaign, telling Amara's story through the media. Articles and reports began to attract public attention, and many began to ask questions about how a policeman could harass an ordinary woman with a child. But not all reactions were positive. Some radical groups began threatening Amara and Rachel on social media, accusing them of shaming the police and whipping up hatred. Even the policeman they accused began spreading rumors through his colleagues that Amara was lying, and that the whole story was an attempt to discredit him. One evening, as they were having dinner at Rachel's house, the doorbell rang. Amara frowned. Rachel went to open it, and returned a minute later with an envelope in her hands. Her face was pale. "This is for you," she said, handing Amara the letter. Amara opened the envelope, and her hands trembled when she saw the photo inside. The picture showed her and Leela walking in the park, where they had been a few days ago. Someone was obviously watching them. At the bottom of the photo, it was written in large letters, "We will find you, wherever you are." Amara felt the world shrink around her. She realized that now it had come to an extreme. This man wasn't just stalking her, he was playing a dangerous game, and she didn't know how far he would go. Night had fallen on the city, and the quiet streets were flooded with the cold light of street lamps. There was a tense silence in Rachel's house. Amara was sitting on the edge of the sofa, hugging Layla tightly to herself. The girl was asleep, but her restless breathing reflected the fear that was in the air. Amara knew that they could no longer afford to relax. Their pursuer was somewhere nearby, and it was only a matter of time before he decided to strike again. Rachel returned to the room with an anxious expression on her face. "I talked to the media," she said, sitting down next to me. "They are ready to make our case public, but this will not stop it right away. We must be prepared for what will be worse." Amara nodded. She couldn't help but think that this had gone too far. This policeman didn't just want to scare her, enjoyed their fear. "We need to do something, Rachel." Amara looked at the lawyer with determination. "I can't hide anymore. If I don't fight back, he won't stop, but I don't want to put Leela in danger." Rachel thought about it. Her gaze became serious. "We have to be careful, but I agree. If he realizes that you are not afraid, it can change his strategy. But today, we have to be especially on the alert. There have been reports on the news of strange cars circling the area. I wouldn't be surprised if it's him or his people." Amara tensed up. My heart was pounding faster. "Cars," she repeated, feeling a growing anxiety. Rachel got up and went to the window, carefully lifting the curtain. "They have already passed by our house several times. I'm sure he's watching us. The question is when he decides to do something serious." Suddenly, the muffled sound of an engine was heard from the street. Amara tensed up and went to the window. A black car with tinted windows stopped on the street. The engine died down, but the driver did not get out. "I was just sitting in the shade, watching the house." "Damn, it's him," Rachel whispered, and her voice trembled slightly. "We must act quickly. Take Leela and pack the essentials. We can't stay here." "Where are we going?" Amara tried to stay calm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. "I have an old friend who can shelter us for a while. He lives outside the city. He has a safe house. We'll go there," Rachel replied, checking her phone. "But we have to leave unnoticed. I'll call him. He'll bring another car to the backyard." Amara quickly began to pack her things, trying not to make any noise so as not to wake Leah. Panic was building inside, but she kept it under control for her daughter's sake. Time passed slowly. The pounding of her heart drowned out everything around her as she collected several bags. Layla was fast asleep, unaware of what was happening. Meanwhile, Rachel was calling her friend, explaining the situation. They didn't know how much time they had before the policeman decided to act. When everything was ready, Amara gently lifted Layla in her arms, and they headed for the back door. The darkness behind the house hid them from prying eyes, but they knew that their pursuer was close. At that moment, the sound of the front door opening rang out and Amara frowned. Someone entered the house. and their chances of escape decreased dramatically. Rachel quickly grabbed Amara's hand and motioned for her to move faster. They quietly descended the stairs, trying to remain unnoticed. Layla woke up for a moment, but when she felt her mother next to her, she downseat off again. Another car was already waiting for them in the backyard. As soon as they arrived, the driver, an old acquaintance of Rachel's, nodded and opened the door. Helping them in, Amara felt her heart constrict in fear and relief at the same time. As they drove away, Amara finally realized how close they were to real danger. A car parked outside their house started following them. The driver made a sharp turn, trying to break away, but the pursuer did not give up. Amara heard gunshots in the distant seat was a signal that their enemy would not stop. "He's following us," she cried out, feeling the fear cover her with renewed force. The driver was staring intently at the road. "I know," he said shortly, turning the steering wheel. "Hold on, it won't be easy." The car made a sharp maneuver, crashing into a side street. Their pursuer was still on their tail, not giving them a chance to get away. Layla woke up from the tremors, and fear appeared in her eyes. "Mommy, what's going on? What is it?" she asked, squeezing Amara's hand. "It's going to be okay, honey. We're just going to play hide-and-seek for a while," Amara whispered soothingly, even though everything was boiling inside. The car turned again, making several unexpected maneuvers, and finally, the pursuer fell behind, leaving them in the darkness of the night streets. Amara breathed out a sigh of relief, but she knew that this was only a temporary victory. The car drove away from the place where their pursuer had lost track. But despite this, Amara could not get rid of the feeling of anxiety. They were making their way to Rachel's safe house, but her thoughts were only on what lay ahead. When they finally arrived, an old acquaintance of Rachel's opened the door and motioned them in. The house looked modest but cozy, with low ceilings and soft lamplight that created an atmosphere of warmth and safety. Rachel quickly assessed the situation, making sure no one was watching them before closing the door behind them. "We're safe," she said, but Amara knew it was only a temporary measure. Footsteps and gunshots could still be heard inside. Layla, still in Amara's arms, looked at her mother with concern. "Mom, when are we going to get home? What is it?" she asked, clutching the toy bear. Amara smiled, trying to hide her own fears. "Soon, honey. We're just going to stay here a little while until everything settles down." Rachel turned on the TV to distract Layla, and she went over to Amara. "We need to come up with a plan. I've already thought about how we can expose him. If we can gather enough evidence, it will help us in the fight." "But how do we do it?" Amara asked, feeling her strength drain away. "He's watching us all the time. I do not know if we can take the risk again." "We can use the old method, secretly record his actions. Gather witnesses," Rachel suggested. "I can turn to activists who will help us. It's going to be harder than just avoiding it, but we need to do it so that other women don't end up in the same situation." Amara thought about it, but her anxiety still persisted. "What if he finds us? What is it?" she asked, looking out the window. The night was calm, but she had a feeling that the danger had not receded. "If he finds us, we'll be ready," Rachel looked confident. "We will install hidden cameras. I'll take care not to leave any traces, but we need a little time to organize everything." The next morning they began to act. Rachel contacted a group of activists who agreed to help them. They organized a meeting in a safe place where they could discuss a plan of action. Amara, although she was afraid, realized that this was her chance to do something important, not only for herself, but also for other women facing violence and intimidation. Meanwhile, Leela stayed with Rachel, and Amara went to a meeting with activists. This was her first attempt to take control of the situation. She could feel the determination building up inside her. At the meeting, she shared her story, and people listened with attention. One of them suggested holding a support rally to attract the attention of the public and journalists. When the meeting came to an end, one of the activists, Jason, came up with an idea. "We can arrange a protest in front of the police department. It will attract attention, and if we can record everything on video, it will be our proof. We have to show that we are not afraid." Amara nodded, realizing that this could be a turning point. She needed to show her strength, not only for herself, but also for others. The next day, the protest began. People took to the streets carrying posters with slogans about justice and equality. Amara stood in the first line, feeling the support of the crowd give her strength. This was her moment to say that she would no longer be silent. But as the protest continued and the crowd began to gain strength, Amara noticed a familiar black car with tinted windows appear in the distance. Her heart began to beat faster. She knew it was that policeman, and he came again to intimidate her and everyone else. The moment when they would collide was approaching. Amara felt the tension building in the air as the protesters began shouting slogans. The situation could flare up at any moment, and Amara knew that now was the time to show her determination. The crowd grew, and slogans about justice and equality thundered. Amara stood in the front row, feeling the energy build up around her, but when she saw the black car with tinted windows, her heart began to beat faster. It was that policeman! She knew he had come to intimidate her and the protesters. As soon as he got out of the car, the tension in the air became palpable. Other police officers began to approach the protest, and Amara understood that they intended to disperse the crowd. She raised her voice above the shout of the crowd. "We are here to demand justice. We're not leaving." In response to her words, the protesters began to shout even louder, supporting her, but the policeman who was approaching stopped a few meters away from her, confidently looking at the crowd. "This is an illegal gathering," he said, his voice full of menace. "Put away your things and disperse, otherwise I will be forced to use force." Amara felt fear shoot through her, but instead of backing away, she took a step forward. "We will not disperse until our demands are heard. You can't intimidate us." The police began to move closer, and Amara noticed one of the activists, Jason, coming up to her, supporting her. "Amara, we need to be careful," he whispered, his eyes full of anxiety. But at this moment, when the tension reached its peak, the sound of shocking grenades rang out. The cardboard boxes in which the protesters kept their posters flew apart as the police began to move towards the crowd. People screamed, panic swept the streets, and Amara realized that this was a serious collision. She saw one of the policemen, the one who was chasing her, start pushing the protesters. It wasn't just suppression enjoyed it. Amara felt her heart constrict with anger. She couldn't let that happen. Suddenly, her fear turned into determination. "Everyone back up," she shouted, realizing that they needed to form a protective circle. She raised her hands, urging others to calm down. "We have to stay together." The protesters began to line up, creating a human shield. The police came closer, but suddenly the crowd gathered around Amara. At that moment, one of the activists turned on the camera, recording everything that was happening on video. "We demand respect," Amara screamed again, ignoring the growing tension. She was the center of attention, and her words resonated in the hearts of everyone present. Suddenly, when it seemed that the situation was becoming unpredictable, one of the policemen stood by her side. He walked up to Amara and said softly, "I do not agree with what is happening here. You are not alone." It was unexpected. Amara couldn't believe her ears. She understood that this policeman was risking everything, but his support could be a decisive moment. "Are you ready to help us? What is it?" she asked, looking into his eyes. "I'll try," he replied, then returned to his colleagues. This gave Amara new hope. Meanwhile, the protesters, seeing that someone from the police was on their side, began shouting words of support. This boosted morale, and they became even louder. "Justice for all," they shouted. Amara knew that they were standing on the edge of a precipice. If a policeman decides to intervene, it can lead to violence. But now she had support, and she wasn't going to back down. She turned to the activists. "We have to be ready. If it decides to attack, we will defend ourselves." The protesters nodded, realizing that every moment mattered. But while they were waiting for the situation to develop, Rachel approached Amara, who was looking at what was happening with concern. "I see what you're going to do," she said, "but we have to be careful. If they start acting, we'll need to leave." "I can't leave, Rachel," Amara replied. "We are here to show that we are not afraid, and if we leave now, we will betray everything we are fighting for." At that moment, there was another shout from the crowd, and Amara saw the police officers begin to act. The excitement was building, and she knew that this would be the decisive moment in their fight. The crowd roared as the police began to move forward, taking steps towards the protesters. Amara felt the adrenaline ripping through her from the inside out. There was tension all around, and every look was full of expectation. She understood that everything now depended on their willingness. "We need to keep order," she said, addressing the protesters. "If we work together, they won't be able to break us." At that moment, one of the policemen, the one who approached her, began talking to other officers. He pretended to be discussing something important, but Amara noticed how he looked at her from time to time. This was her chance. "Look," she said, raising her hand to attract attention. "This protest is not just about us. It's about showing that we are all together against injustice. We are not going to give up." The crowd supported her, and the cries for justice rang out again. The police stopped, but the tension remained rising. Amara felt the support of the protesters give her strength, and she knew she had to act. "We have to record everything that happens," she said, addressing the activists. "This is our way of showing that we are not silent." At that moment, one of the activists raised his camera, and more people began to turn on their phones. Everyone wanted to capture a moment that could be an important testimony to their struggle. As soon as the protesters began to capture the situation on video, one of the policemen took a step forward. He said loudly, "You are all under arrest for participating in an illegal meeting. Get off the street, or we will be forced to use force." The crowd exploded in protest, and Amara, sensing that the situation was getting out of control, decided to act. "We're not leaving. Stop it," she screamed. "We are not criminals. We are fighting for our rights." But the police began to tighten the ring around them. Amara felt her heart pounding in her chest. She realized that violence could begin. "Rachel, prepare everyone for a possible conflict," she whispered, not taking her eyes off the approaching policeman. Rachel nodded, her face set in determination. "Protesters, be ready to defend," she shouted, and the crowd, as if with a single force, responded with a loud shout. As the police began to take steps forward, one of the protesters, Jason, moved forward with cameras. He shouted, "We're writing it all down, every step you take." At that moment, the policeman who had approached Amara earlier stepped forward and raised his hand. "Stop," he said, trying to restrain his colleagues. "Take your time. We can resolve this peacefully." Amara felt everything around her freeze. This policeman clearly knew that if things got out of control, the consequences would be disastrous for everyone. "We are not here to fight," he continued, addressing his colleagues. "These people just want to be heard." As his words reached the rest of the police, the protesters began to chant, "We are the people! We are the people!" This moment has become critical. The policeman looked at Amara and, despite his uniform, he was willing to take risks. Amara came closer, preparing to speak. "If you want a dialogue, we're ready to talk," she said, trying to remain calm. "We just want our voices to be heard." But at that moment, one of the more aggressive policemen, unhappy with what was happening, pulled out a baton and shouted, "Disperse, or we will begin to act." This caused a wave of panic. People began to jostle, and Amara felt fear engulf the crowd again. She quickly realized that the only option to keep the situation under control was calm and confident. "No, we stand together. Stop it," she screamed. "We're not leaving." As if influenced by her words, the crowd gathered again. This moment became decisive. The protesters stood clasping each other's hands and confronted the police. Amara's gaze met with the policeman who stood by her side, and she saw that he was ready to help. "Together we can solve this," she said, raising her voice so that everyone could hear her. There was a moment of silence, and it became obvious that both the police and the protesters were on edge. Everyone understood that further actions would determine how the situation would develop. And then, in that moment of intense expectation, Amara knew that she was not just fighting for herself, she was fighting for everyone who had ever faced injustice. In a moment of mounting tension, Amara felt that this was not just a protest, it was a battle for their rights, for their votes. Each protester stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to support each other, and this gave her strength. The policeman who was supporting her stepped forward again. "Listen," he said to his colleagues, his voice firm. "If any of us use force, it will be a disaster for everyone. Let's try to resolve this peacefully. We have to listen to them." But the more aggressive officers disagreed. One of them, with a malicious grin, said, "We are not afraid of you. You're all breaking the law." The crowd responded with shouts of outrage, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. Amara felt her anger rise. "We are not criminals," she shouted to the police. "We are here to say that justice must exist for everyone. We will not leave until our voices are heard." At that moment, she saw several journalists begin to record what was happening on camera. It gave her confidence. She knew that every moment was important, and that their story needed to be heard. But then, amid the screams in the crowd, there was a loud crash. One of the protesters dropped a poster, and this led to a domino effect. The police, frightened and feeling threatened, abruptly began to act. "Disperse," one of the policemen shouted, pulling out a baton. Suddenly, the crowd surged back, and Amara felt her heart beat faster. She knew it was important to stay put right now, but there was panic all around. "Stay where you are," she shouted, trying to rally the protesters, but the sounds of the crowd grew louder and no one heard her. And at that moment, she noticed Jason appear in the crowd, holding a camera in his hands. He went up to her and shouted, "Amara, they're going to use tear gas." Those words pierced her like lightning. She knew it could lead to chaos, and she needed to act quickly. "Everyone who can, stay close," she screamed, raising her hands. "We must unite and stick together." But before they could react, a sharp sound rang out from behind the police. It was a tear gas grenade. She got right into the middle of the crowd, and soon the protesters began coughing and choking. Go ahead, Amara screamed as the crowd began to disperse, and she tried to squeeze through the panicked faces. She knew she had to get Layla and Rachel to a safe place. "Rachel, where is Leela?" she screamed, her voice full of alarm. "I'm with her." Rachel grabbed Layla's hand and pulled her towards Amara. "Quick, over here." The tear gas had already begun to take effect, and the protesters were panicking and trying to find a way out. Amara looked at the police officers, who continued to move forward, and realized that they had lost control. "Follow me," she shouted, turning to the crowd. "We need to find shelter." Together with Rachel and Leela, they began to move towards a nearby park, where trees could provide shelter from the gases. But at every step they heard screams and sounds that reminded them of the impending danger. When they reached the park, Amara turned to make sure the rest of the protesters were following them. She saw several activists trying to organize people, but many were in a panic and couldn't get together. "We have to help," she screamed, realizing that every voice was important at this moment. Suddenly, shots rang out from behind the trees. These were not warning shots, it was a real threat. Amara felt the world around her freeze, and her eyes widened in fear. "Run," she screamed, her voice filled with panic. People began to run in different directions, and Amara, along with Rachel and Layla, found themselves in the center of chaos again. "We need to find a safe place," she kept repeating, but she didn't know where to go. And then, at that moment, she remembered the policeman who had supported her. He might be the only one who could help. "We have to get back to the protest," she screamed, hoping that her words would be heard. "They can't intimidate us." They started moving towards the protest again, and Amara saw Jason, with cameras, standing in front of the police, recording what was happening. "I won't let them break you," he shouted, and his determination inspired the protesters. Together they began together, and Amara knew that it was important not to give up now. Their voices had to be heard, even if it was dangerous. She gathered her strength, looked at her daughter and Rachel, and realized that she would do anything for them. "We are here to show that we are not afraid," she shouted, and the crowd began to gather again, ready to meet any challenge. It was the moment when everyone realized that they were standing together. With each cry for justice, they grew stronger, and Amara knew that this night would determine not only their fates, but also the fates of many who had ever experienced injustice. As the protesters began to gather again, Amara felt her resolve building inside her. The people around her were full of energy and readiness for action. The crowd started shouting slogans again, and every phrase sounded like a loud call for justice. The policeman who had previously supported her came forward again. His eyes were full of anxiety, but he was still standing on the side of the protesters. "I know what's going on, and I'm ready to help you," he said, looking around the crowd. "But we need to be careful. They will not retreat without a fight." Amara nodded. She knew they needed to act and quickly came up with a plan. "We have to show that there are many of us and that we are not going to give up," she said, addressing the protesters. "Let's organize a march to the city hall. We must have our demands heard." The crowd reacted enthusiastically, and soon they began to move towards the city hall. As we moved towards our destination, the atmosphere became more and more tense. The screams of the protesters mingled with the street sounds of the city, and Amara felt her heart pounding with excitement and fear. As soon as they reached the city hall, The situation escalated. The police were already waiting for them, and Amara noticed how some officers were clutching batons, ready for action. At that moment, she realized that their protest had reached a critical point. "We are here to be heard," Amara shouted, raising her hands. "We demand justice and respect." But in response to her words, one of the policemen, the aggressive one who had previously shouted at the protesters, stepped forward and shouted, "Disperse, you don't have permission for this meeting." The crowd began to panic, and Amara realized that they might lose control. She raised her hands, trying to calm the protesters. "Wait, we will not retreat," she screamed, trying to keep the confidence in her voice. "We have the right to vote." At that moment, when the tension reached its peak, someone from the crowd shouted, "Take it off, they can't stop us." People started pulling out their phones, recording what was happening on video. This gave the protesters confidence, and they started chanting again. "We are the people, we are the people." The policeman, who was supporting Amara, stepped closer to the crowd, his gaze full of determination. "They can't intimidate you," he said, addressing the protesters, "but we have to be careful. If violence starts, no one wins." This was the decisive moment. Amara felt the forces coming together, and the protesters raised their voices again. They started chanting, and Amara, looking at her friends and supporters, realized that they were not alone. But at that moment, additional police officers appeared from the other side of the street. They came with shields and rubber batons, ready for any eventuality. "It won't be long," one of the new policemen shouted. "Get off the street, otherwise we will act." The crowd began to panic again, and Amara knew she needed to react quickly. "We're not leaving," she screamed, trying to stop the panic. "We are here to bring about change." But at this time, one of the protesters, noticing the approaching police cars, shouted, "They're going to disperse us." This caused a new surge of anxiety. People began to retreat, and Amara felt panic engulf the crowd again. She understood that it was important not to give up now. "Listen up," she screamed, raising her hands. "If we split up, they'll win. We must stand together." Her words began to take effect. The protesters, inspired by her determination, began to return to their seats, forming a human wall. "We are here to be heard," Amara shouted again. "We're not leaving until we get our rights." This time her words were heard, and the protesters raised their voices again. At that moment, the tension in the air became almost palpable. But the police, seeing that the crowd was not going to disperse, began to act. They moved forward, shields at the ready. "If you do not disperse, we will be forced to use force," the commander shouted. And at that moment, something unexpected happened. The policeman who was supporting Amara raised his hand, stopping his colleagues. "Wait," he shouted, "let's talk. We can resolve this peacefully." It was a critical moment. Amara felt hope reignite inside her. She knew this might be their chance. "We are ready for a dialogue," she shouted, looking around the crowd. "We want to hear from you." The policeman looked at the protesters, his eyes searching for understanding. "If you disperse peacefully, I promise that you will be able to discuss your demands with the mayor," he said. Amara knew that this might be their only chance, but her heart was pounding with anxiety. What if they're just trying to distract their attention? "We will not leave until we are sure that we will be heard," she replied, her voice firm. The crowd started shouting again, and the tension reached its peak. At this point, everything depended on how both sides behaved. The policeman, who was supporting Amara, stepped closer to the protesters, his expression becoming more determined. "Listen," he said, his voice firm. "If you disperse peacefully, I promise that the mayor will listen to you. We can solve this without violence." The crowd frowned. Amara felt the tension in the air. She knew that many doubted the sincerity of his words, but she still understood that this was their chance. "What can we do? What is it?" she asked, trying to get the attention of the protesters. "We can demand to be listened to, and at the same time not give in to provocations." Several protesters began to exchange glances, and the tension in the crowd gradually began to ease. "Let's try it," one of the activists said, and the others began to support her. At that moment, Amara felt hope ignite inside her. She turned to the policeman. "If we leave, will you really convince the mayor to meet with us?" He nodded, his face showing determination. "I'll do my best, but it depends on how you behave." Amara looked at the crowd, her heart pounding. "We can be strong without succumbing to provocations," she said, and the protesters began to repeat her words. "Let's show that we can solve this peacefully. Stop it," she screamed. And the protesters, inspired by her words, began to disperse slowly, but did not go far. They formed a ring around the policeman to show that they would not give up and would continue to fight for their rights. At this time, reporters began to approach from the other side of the city hall. Amara noticed several cameras pointed at her, and that gave her an extra boost. "We're here for a reason," she began when one of the journalists approached her. "We are fighting for justice and the right to be heard. Our struggle is not just a protest. This is the voice of each of us." As soon as her words were spoken, the crowd started chanting again, "Justice, justice." The policeman, noticing that the protesters were not going to leave, came closer to the commanders and whispered something to them. He soon returned to Amara. "The mayor agrees to meet with you," he said, "if you behave peacefully and leave the street." Amara felt a wave of hope wash over her. She turned to the protesters. "We can get a meeting, but only if we show that we are capable of acting peacefully." The crowd began to support her again, and there were shouts of agreement among the protesters. "We're leaving, but we don't forget," one of the activists shouted, and the others picked up. Gradually, the protesters began to disperse, but did not go far, but gathered around the city hall. Amara felt that this was just the beginning. They will achieve their goal and their voices will be heard. Suddenly, sirens sounded, and Amara turned around when she saw cars with security measures approaching the city hall. "We need to be careful," she said, and the protesters gathered again in a more dense group. "We are here to fight," she said, looking at her supporters. "This is only the first step. We must be ready to continue, even if it is difficult." At that moment, the mayor came up to them, surrounded by several counselors. "I've heard about your struggle," he began. "I'm here to listen to your demands." Amara came closer, her heart pounding. This was the opportunity they were waiting for. "We demand justice and respect," she shouted, and the protesters supported her. The mayor nodded, listening to them. Amara knew it would be a long road, but they were ready to fight for their rights. And this is just the beginning of their struggle. Amara could feel the growing excitement permeating the crowd. She stood in front, looking at the mayor and his team, and realized that this moment was more important than any other event in her life. "We're here to talk about what's going on in our community," she began, her voice full of determination. "We demand transparency, responsibility, and fairness. Our lives matter." The crowd took up her words, and loud shouts of "Our lives matter" echoed through the square. The mayor, feeling the pressure, nodded. "I understand your concern, and I am ready to listen to you, but we need to talk about specific requirements. What exactly do you want to change?" Amara knew that it was important to articulate their demands clearly now. She turned to the protesters and saw how many of them were waiting for her words, full of hope and expectation. "We want to review police practices," she began. "We want to create an independent commission to investigate cases of police brutality. We want fair justice for all those who have suffered." Some protesters started holding up posters, and this inspired others. The mayor looked at them, his expression becoming more and more serious. "I promise that these issues will be considered," he said, "but for this I need your understanding and support. We must work together to establish a dialogue." Amara felt the atmosphere begin to change. "We are ready for dialogue," she said, "but it has to be a sincere conversation. We will not back down until we see real changes." The crowd started chanting again. It was like a charge of energy that passed through them. The mayor looked at his advisors, and one of them, a tall man with glasses, said, "Maybe we should organize public meetings so that you can directly voice your demands." Amara nodded, realizing that this could be a step forward. "It's a good idea, but we need these meetings to be safe for everyone involved," she said. "We need to see that the police are also ready to work on changes." The mayor agreed, and the conversation became more constructive. They began to discuss the details, and against this background, Amara noticed how the people in the crowd began to calm down. There was hope in their eyes, and it gave her strength. After a long discussion, the mayor finally concluded, "We will create a working group that will consist of representatives of your community and the police. I encourage you all to participate in this dialogue." Amara knew that this was just the beginning. She turned to the crowd and saw them supporting her. Their faces expressed determination and willingness to fight for their rights. "This is not the end. Stop it," she screamed. "We must continue to remain strong and united. We will make sure that our requirements are met." The protesters began to applaud, and at that moment, the tension that had been hanging in the air dissipated. They knew that they had taken a step towards change, and it inspired them. But suddenly Amara noticed how new police cars appeared on the horizon, and excitement swept the crowd again. "They're still here," one of the activists shouted, and the fear began to awaken again. "Don't panic," Amara shouted. "We are here for a peaceful dialogue, and this should remain our priority." She saw how the police began to line up along the street, but instead of aggression, they held shields, as if protecting the protesters. "This is your chance to show that you want a change," said the policeman who had supported her earlier. "Let us know that you are ready for peace." The crowd began to gather, and without waiting for a command, Amara raised her fist. It was a symbol of unity, and the protesters picked up on her gesture, repeating after her. "We are united, we are strong," she screamed, and it was repeated over and over again. Now it has become not just a struggle for justice, but also a symbol of their unity. Amara knew that there would be difficulties ahead, but they are ready to fight for their rights and for their loved ones. The protesters began to leave, but it was not a defeat. It was the beginning of a new stage in their struggle. They knew that their voices would be heard, and they would push for the changes that their community needed so much. Amara stood in front of the mirror, preparing for the next meeting of the working group. Her reflection seemed unfamiliar to her. There were shadows of fatigue on her cheeks, and in her eyes, there was a determination that she did not always feel inside. Looking at her daughter playing with toys on the floor, she felt an inner struggle. Every time she went outside to fight for change, she risked not only her health, but also the safety of her family. A lot of people gathered at the meeting at the city hall, representatives of the police, activists, members of the local community. The situation was tense, but they all understood that this meeting could be the key to change. Amara took her place at the table, feeling the eyes on her. "We're here to discuss concrete steps to reform our police force," she began, trying to sound confident. "We must set new standards and achieve transparency in the work of law enforcement agencies." The policemen sitting opposite looked at each other, and one of them, a senior officer with a stern face, said, "We are not against reforms, but we need time to adapt. Not all employees are ready for changes." Amara felt the tension building. She recalled how many times her own words about the need for change had been met with discontent and prejudice. "We all understand that change takes time," she replied, "but we can't wait for the system to continue hurting our communities. People demand justice, and we must act quickly." After much discussion and heated debate, the group agreed to establish an independent commission to investigate cases of police brutality. It was an important achievement, but Amara knew that difficult challenges lay ahead. The next day, when she was returning home, her phone rang. It was a text from her brother. He wrote about how his friends did not understand her activism and considered her problematic. These words deeply hurt Amara. She reflected that she might have to make a choice between family and fighting for justice. In the evening, when she was cooking dinner, her daughter came up to her with a question. "Mom, why do you leave so often? Aren't you scared?" Amara frowned. This question made her heart sink. She sat her down next to her daughter and replied, "I'm fighting for us. To your future, I want you to grow up in a world where everyone is equal and no one is offended." The girl thought about it, but there was still fear in her eyes. Amara felt that she needed to change something to show her daughter that she, too, could be a part of this struggle without fear. The next day, Amara organized a meeting for children and their parents at the local library, where the topics of equality and respect were discussed. She wanted her daughter to see how people can unite and support each other. During the meeting, Amara spoke about the importance of fighting for rights and how everyone can contribute. She noticed how her daughter's eyes shone when other children started asking questions and sharing their thoughts. But soon there were screams in the library. A group of protesters came in support, and among them Amara saw her old enemy, who had previously insulted her. He started shouting that their struggle made no sense, and that such actions only fueled hatred. Amara felt the tension building. She couldn't let fear destroy the atmosphere they had created. "Listen up," she shouted, turning to the protesters. "We are here to learn and grow. Our strength lies in our unity and respect for each other." The scream stopped, and for a moment there was silence. People's eyes met, and one of the protesters smiled and supported her. "We all want change, but by doing it together, we can achieve more." The crowd began to repeat her words, and this support helped Amara feel confident. At the end of the meeting, when she returned home, her daughter hugged her and said, "Mom, I want to help. I also want everyone to be equal." Amara realized that her struggle was not in vain. Together they will create a future full of hope and justice. A working group, full of expectations and tension, gathered at the city hall. Amara felt her heart pounding in her chest as she entered the hall. The faces around her expressed a mixture of hope and skepticism, and she knew that this meeting could be decisive. The senior police officers, the one who had previously spoken out against the reforms, was sitting at the other end of the table. His face remained serious. Amara, despite her excitement, decided to approach the matter with confidence. "We're here to create change," she began, her voice firm. "We need to eliminate bias and build trust between the police and our community. But to do this, you need to act quickly and decisively." The discussion began with intense arguments. Officers voiced concerns about a lack of resources, while activists raised their voices in defense of their demands. Amara could feel all eyes on her, and it gave her strength. "We can't let fear and distrust control our actions," she said, raising her hand to attract attention. "We need to create a training program for police officers so that they understand what our communities face every day." Some of the officers began to look at each other, unhappy with her offer, but Amara was not going to give up. She addressed the audience. "It's not just about the police, it's about our future. We want our children to grow up in a world where their lives and dignity matter." Finally, one of the officers, a younger one, raised his hand and said, "I agree. I can see for myself how important it is to change the way we approach the people we work with. We have to start with ourselves." This moment was a turning point. The others began to support him, and soon the discussion became more constructive. They discussed the creation of an independent commission to monitor investigations into police brutality. As the discussion progressed, time became less and less. Amara felt that she had a responsibility on her shoulders, and she had to do everything possible to make it happen. In the evening, when the meeting ended, she went outside, full of hope and excitement, but looking back, she noticed a group of protesters who had gathered at the city hall, and her heart sank. They looked tired but determined. Amara came up to them and started talking. "Today we took a step towards change," she said. "We have created an opportunity for dialogue, but we need you to stay with us." The protesters began chanting her name. Suddenly she noticed that her old enemy, a man who constantly opposed her initiatives, was standing among them. His face was full of hatred and aggression. "Do you think that you will change something?" he shouted. "This is just the beginning of the end." Amara felt the tension in the air become palpable. She knew that his words could fuel the aggression of the crowd, and decided to act. "Listen up," she screamed, raising her hands. "We are not here to incite hatred. We are here to seek justice peacefully." The crowd frowned. Amara saw some of them start nodding. She felt a surge of strength. "We all want change, but only together we can achieve it." Suddenly, the crowd started chanting again, but there were others among them with opposing views. The conflict began to escalate, and Amara realized that this could lead to violence. She looked at her supporters and realized that she needed to take responsibility now. "Let's have a meeting," she suggested. "We need to listen to each other to figure out how to move on." The crowd frowned, and soon the agreement became general. Amara knew it wouldn't be an easy path, but right now they had to show that they could act together. The meeting was scheduled for the next day, and when Amara left the city hall, she felt that although their path would be difficult, she was not alone. They were all ready to fight for justice and peace together, and that was the main thing. That night she went to bed thinking about how much was ahead. The battle for justice was just beginning, and she was ready for any challenges that might await her. When the day of the meeting came, thousands of people gathered at the local center. Activists, police officers, and community members. Amara, standing on the stage, felt a storm of emotions raging inside her. Every look, every word mattered, and she knew that their future depended on this moment. "We're here to talk about reforms," she began, looking at the audience. "But first of all, we need to hear each other. Let's discuss what justice means to us and how we can achieve it." Some police officers looked worried. Others looked at the activists with disbelief. One of the officers, the one who had supported her at the last meeting, raised his hand. "I want to say that changes are possible, but we need to work together," he said. "We are not enemies, but without your help, we will not be able to change the system." Amara felt the tension in the room began to subside. People began to discuss, share opinions, and soon a passionate debate broke out. But amid the general shout and agreement, there was also a noise of discontent. Suddenly, one of the protesters stood up and shouted, "You can talk as much as you want, but they can't hear us. We are tired of promises." The crowd frowned. Amara saw fear and anger appear on people's faces. She knew she had to act now. "We're all here because we care," she said, trying to calm the crowd. "But if we are not ready for a real dialogue, then all this will become empty words." At that moment, someone from the back shouted, "We don't just want discussions, we want action." Amara felt the tension building. She looked at the faces of people full of expectation, and understood that it depended on her how the situation would develop further. "All right," she said, gathering her thoughts. "If someone wants to, I'm ready to take responsibility. Let's create an action plan. Together we can do something real." The crowd frowned and then began to applaud. She knew they had a chance. The meeting continued, and soon they developed a strategy to create a committee to investigate police brutality, which included representatives from both sides. Amara felt a surge of hope. However, at that moment, the same old enemy entered the hall, the man who had previously opposed her initiatives. He was grinning at the crowd, and there was obvious aggression on his face. "Do you think that this will change something?" he shouted. "It won't work. It's just an illusion." Amara felt her anger overwhelm her. She knew that his words could destroy what they were building. "We're here to make a difference," she replied, clenching her fists. "And this is not an illusion. This is our future." The crowd cheered again, but the tension in the air was palpable. People began to share their fears and experiences, and soon the screams turned into conversations about what they could do. The meeting ended, but Amara's heart remained bitter. Although they had taken a step towards change, she knew that this was only the beginning of the path. When she went outside, she felt the wind on her face. There were many challenges ahead. But when she turned around to look at the crowd, she noticed that people were starting to disperse. There was a desire to continue fighting in their eyes. Suddenly, Amara felt someone grab her by the shoulder. It was her brother, who did not support her activism. "Mom, you don't have to leave us," he said, looking into her eyes. "We need you." Her heart sank. She knew that the path would be difficult, and that her activism could alienate her from her loved ones. "I won't leave you," she replied with determination. "I will fight for all of us." And at that moment, amid the dwindling crowd, she realized that at least a small change had already taken place. Every voice, every story, every step towards mutual understanding was important. Nevertheless, as she looked up at the horizon, Amara knew that this was just the beginning. And at that time, the sounds of new protests were heard somewhere in the city. The cries of justice echoed in the air again, and the struggle for equality continued like an endless stream. Amara knew they couldn't stop. Their journey has just begun, and there will be many difficulties and trials ahead. But with every step they got stronger, and it gave her hope. Gathering her thoughts, she took a step forward, ready for new challenges, knowing that her voice and the voice of her community would be heard as they continued to fight for a better future. And it wasn't just a conclusion, it was a promise to keep moving forward despite everything.
Subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to write a comment where you were watching this video from. I wish you all the best and happiness in life.